basically April's photo was this. She says, I'm trying to learn if this photo is considered shallow field of depth photo or depth of field. The landscape is blurry in the background. I read that it can be blurry in the forefront and background, but does not have to be. I would love to see other examples out there. Thank you. So I thought what I would do with this one, this is really, if you have a DSLR or a bridge camera where you can adjust the aperture, shallow depth of field is all about your aperture. If your camera's on auto, it will sometimes widen the aperture for you. Now, basically, the depth of field is how much is in focus when you take the camera. A shallow depth of field means not a lot. So if you take a photo of something, that bit might be in focus, but a little bit in front, a little bit behind will be out of focus. If you've got a deeper or bigger depth of field, then all of this in between might be in focus. Now, whilst without doubt the background is blurry in this, it's not in focus as in focus as the butterfly. When people really talk about, if you're talking about like the competitions like you get on Photo Crowd or Viewbug or Guru Shots and things like that, when people talk about a shallow depth of field photo, what they're really wanting is something with a very shallow depth of field. They're wanting something with what's known as bokeh, or that might be one way of pronouncing it, B-O-K-E-H. Translation of sort of anglicized translation of a Japanese word, which is about the quality of the blur in the background. And actually at this point, I suppose, if we go back to the squirrel photo that I showed you earlier, this is much more of a shallow depth of field where we have exactly what you're talking about, where it's not just blurred in the background, it's blurred in the foreground as well. So you can tell that there's little branches in the foreground and there's branches in the background, and beyond that branch it just gets completely out of focus. We can't even tell what's in the background anymore. The depth of focus is so narrow that there's not a lot in it, to the point whereby the eye is in focus and the front ear is in focus, but even the ear behind is starting to go out of focus. It's so narrow. And what you're doing is you're playing with that quality. And when you get people asking for you to submit images to competitions or contests where they talk about shallow depth of field, you want to try and get it as shallow as possible. And for that, you want a wide aperture, which is a low F number. So what I'm going to do here, I did a set of photos earlier in the summer, which I've never got around to doing anything with. They might well end up in some course I make at some point in the future. But what I did was I got a bunch of cones, pine cones, sitting on a little bench in the garden. And so side on, this is what I'm dealing with. So we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cones sitting on a table, all evenly spaced. Okay, that's the setup. Then what I did was I went up to sort of one end and I focused on the third cone in, or maybe I think I only shot 5 of the 6 cones, but let's see. Yeah, here we go. So and this, I'm using a 50mm prime lens. For those who've got it, your nifty 50. So it's a fixed lens. You can't zoom in or out. It's 50mm and it goes to f1.8, which is a really wide aperture, which gives you a really narrow depth of field. And so within this, what we can see is this cone, parts of this cone, the front edge of this cone is nice and sharp. Where you can really notice it is down on the edge of the table here. Part of this table, that's how much depth of field there is. The bit that's sharp, that's the only bit that's in focus. And the further you go out from that, the more out of focus it becomes. So that's a very clear cone. The cones either side, the cone, are still cone-like. By the time you start getting to the cones at the end, you wouldn't know whether they were cones anyway. I mean, you can guess, but you wouldn't necessarily be totally sure. There could be a hedgehog there, but So that's set at f1.8. That's as wide an aperture as I can get with the shallowest depth of field you can get. So then what I did was I put the aperture, I narrowed it a little bit to f2.8, which is still quite wide. And what you notice here is there's a little bit more starting to come into focus. Then I went to f5.6. So now I'm narrowing it a bit more, which is giving us a deeper depth of field. And now we can see much more clearly that those are definitely cones in front at the end. We're also starting to really notice that there's buildings in the background there. If we go back to this, we might guess that it's buildings, but we can't really, we can see that there's a window shape-ish there, but we can't really make it out. By the time we get to f5.6, we can actually see this window is split into two, an upper part and a lower part of that window, which here you can't see at all. You can just see a vague blur. f8, now the background's coming more into it. f11, f16, and f22. And by the time we get to f22, we can see the background really clearly. Now, it's not to say that it's in complete focus. It isn't. It's still a bit out of focus. But at f22, we've now got a much deeper depth of field. It's not shallow anymore. You wouldn't call that a shallow depth of field picture. So much of the table is in focus. We can see the splinters coming out up here, which we couldn't see earlier. So I think really, to be honest, that's probably about the best example I can give of depth of field. The wider the aperture, which is the smaller the f number, so f1, f2, f3, these things are very wide apertures, give you a very narrow depth of field. The narrower the aperture, the deeper the depth of field. So hopefully then that gives you that sense. And just like do we still have that squirrel photo? Here's a robin photo, similarly done with, I think that was an f2.8, where again, what you can see is the branches and everything disappear out of focus very quickly. And so you can use this effect if you want to isolate a subject. And now a robin in a tree, the tree is very, very busy. There's branches all over the place. But if you have a narrow depth of field, as you go down to something like an f2.8, then you can isolate it because the background becomes blurry, and the thing you're trying to focus on, whether it's the squirrel, whether it's the robin, whether it's the butterfly on the flower, it separates it out from the background much more. So getting to understand your aperture is a really useful thing. So that's how you play with depth of field. So I really hope that helps there, April. If you found this useful, let your friends know and hit subscribe.